Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, dear participants. Um, my name is Gerhard Baumgartner. I am the director of the Austrian Documentation Archives of Austrian Resistance in Vienna. And it is my honor to chair this panel about survivors of racial persecution and their claims after 1945, their recognition and their claims after 1945, a topic which I find especially interesting because I am or I have been involved into Roma, what is called Roma research. So the research into the post-1945 history of especially Austrian Roma and how they managed to survive and how long it took them to actually get recognized as victims of National Socialist persecution and to get some kind of compensation, uh, which took in Austria very long. So their their incarcerations were basically in smaller work camps, and it took till the 1980s to actually get these smaller camps recognized. Even the largest gypsy camp in Austria was not recognized for many, many years. And it took till the 1990s till they got compensation, more or less, uh, for times spent in concentration camps and for other uh, losses that they had. And a very complicated story, but we have an expert on this question of Roma recognition anyway in our panel. Uh, I will briefly introduce the speakers in the panel now, but just before they will be on. So I will start with Kinga Frojimovics, whom I've known personally also as a member of the staff of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. She is well recognized, sorry for my cough. She's a well recognized historian and an archivist. She was since 2007, she was responsible for the Hungarian department in the Yad Vashem archive. Later on, she was a member of the research team of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute at Brandeis University in the USA. And she was one of the first research fellows of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute and has since then, for many, many years, worked on the archival material of the Wiesenthal Institute. And of course, she is a specialist on Jewish religious movements in Hungary and the Holocaust, and of the Hungarian Jewish archives as well, and a co-editor of Makor, yeah, a publication series of the Hungarian Jewish archives. So, dear Kinga, please, may I ask for your presentation?
So thank you very much for the invitation and the kind words. I am trying to share my screen now, just a minute.
Excuse me, I forgot something to say, which a technicality, yes, which Philip has asked me to do. For all the participants here, please, if you want to raise questions or comments, please use not the question and answer function here, but the chat function. And if you go to the chat function, then there is a function that you can activate, which is which says comments and for all participants. So please be certain to click on this button so that we can all see your comments. Ja, auf Deutsch noch einmal, bitte, wenn Sie an der Diskussion teilnehmen wollen oder wenn Sie Kommentare haben, dann bitte über die Chat-Funktion, nicht über die Questions and Answer-Funktion, bitte das zu machen, sondern über die Chat-Funktion. Und wenn Sie die Chat-Funktion öffnen, dann gibt es dort unten rechts meistens eine kleine Einstellungsmöglichkeit, wo Sie sozusagen Kommentare schicken können, aber für alle Zuschauer, glaube ich, heißt es in der deutschen Version, bitte diese Funktion anklicken, damit wir das wirklich machen können. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Kinga for the presentation. Thank you for...
Thank you. My question is that you can see my presentation now? Hello.
Perfect.
Okay,
Perfect.
so I'm starting. Thank you. Okay. So, I will talk about the Holocaust Library and Research Center of San Francisco. It's a San Francisco grassroots organization of Holocaust survivors. The story of the Holocaust Library and Research Center of San Francisco began in the spring of 1977 with a broken store window. In March 1977, the National Socialist White Workers' Party, a neo-Nazi white supremacist American party that was gaining strength in the United States in the 70s, opened a bookstore in San Francisco's Sunset District, just across the street from the headquarters of Congregation Bnei Emunah, a Jewish community in the city made up mostly of Holocaust survivors. In its window is a giant swastika. The party's local leader, Ellen Vincent, reported the event in the first issue of the party's newly founded magazine, The Stormer, as follows. And I am quoting. We opened the Rudolf Hess bookstore to provide a place for anyone in the Bay Area to be able to get books and other publications usually not found in a public library or bookstore. The location was purely coincidental. The store plus living quarters combination plus the reasonable rent that determined the location. We chose the name of Rudolf Hess because he was a National Socialist and a man of peace. We chose the swastika not only because it is the sign of National Socialism, but also because it is the symbol of the Aryan race and has been since the days of the Vikings, end of quote. The Nazi bookstore, named after the peace-loving Rudolf Hess with its Nazi uniformed salesman, was an eyesore in the heart of the San Francisco Jewish quarter, which was preparing for Pesach. Finally, on April 2, 1977, Polish-born Auschwitz survivor Tauba Weiss, who lived nearby, knocked on the door of the bookstore and tried to explain to the man coming out of the store that Nazis are not welcome in the neighborhood, which is populated mostly by Holocaust survivors. The conversation quickly turned into an argument, and after the man explained that his party's aim is to kill the remaining Jews, Tauba grabbed a large rock and smashed the bookshop window. Several people joined the action, including Tauba's husband and son. The crowd, which swelled to about 50 people, completely trashed the shop. The police, who arrived a few minutes later, pushed the neo-Nazi owner of the bookstore into a police car for his own safety, and seated Norman, Tauba's son, who was active in the shop destruction, next to him in the car. Tauba saw this and panicked. And now I am quoting. When I saw that they took him in the car with the Nazi, I started to get very emotional, said Tauba in an interview. And I hear my mother yelling in Yiddish, Moisha, Moisha, your son in the car with the Nazi, added her son in the same interview. And the only thing that I saw is like Auschwitz, finished Tauba recalling her own memories. In response to the shop's smashing, the neo-Nazis smashed the window of Temple Bnei Emunah, and the firefighters and police who arrived on the scene had difficulty restoring order, and several people were arrested. The incident completely shook up the San Francisco Jewish communities, which had been fundamentally separated until then. Jewish public life in the city was dominated by Jewish families from the German-speaking countries of Eastern Europe, of Central Europe, that had arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush in the 19th century. After the Second World War, however, Jewish Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe arrived, mainly from Eastern Europe, arrived in San Francisco and the Bay Area. They had little contact with the German origin Jewish families already established in the city, and their family and community life took place in different settings. In the wake of the bookstore incident, however, Earl Rabb, executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the leader of the San Francisco Jewish community, held a crisis meeting to which he invited not only German Jewish community leaders, but also leading families of Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe, including specifically those who were involved in the attack on the bookstore. The explicit goal of the meeting was to have the traditional community leaders who are already integrated into the local community and who were not directly affected by the Holocaust at the immediate family level understand what Holocaust survivors in the San Francisco Bay Area want, and more specifically, how they envision their more organic integration into the local Jewish community. It soon became clear that the most important thing for Holocaust survivors was to integrate the various forms of Holocaust remembrance into Jewish community life. They also considered their own role in the community to be the most important in the creation and permanent maintenance of these different forms of commemoration. The meeting led to the creation of the Community of Remembrance, which adopted 3 different Holocaust remembrance initiatives. First, the creation of a permanent Holocaust memorial. Second, organizing community-wide Yom HaShoah observance, the Holocaust Day observance. And third, founding of a Holocaust Library and Research Center. A city committee, the Mayor's Holocaust Memorial Committee, was formed to create the Holocaust Memorial. 60% of the members were Holocaust survivors, and the committee was chaired by philanthropist Rhoda Haas Goldman, only daughter of Walter Haas, billionaire businessman, the president and chairman of Levi Strauss Company. The inauguration ceremony of the memorial, designed by George Siegel, took place on August 3rd, 1984. Morris Weiss, an arrestee in the 1977 bookstore incident, husband of Tauba Weiss, died a few days before the ceremony. His prepared speech was read by his wife, Tauba. Survivors did not have to wait long for the first community-wide Yom HaShoah observance to take place, as it was held in 1978. The event, which has been held every year since, was held online only this year, but included a 2-day workshop. To organize and establish the Holocaust Library and Research Center, Earl Rabb immediately after the 1977 meeting invited 2 prominent members of the San Francisco Jewish community. Max Rodriguez Garcia and Lonnie Darwin. Both were Western European Holocaust survivors. Max Rodriguez Garcia summed up the first decades of his life this way in January 2020, when he attended to the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in Auschwitz. And I'm quoting. I am the son of Elias and Rosetta Rodriguez Garcia, a Sephardic Jewish family born in Amsterdam, Holland in 1924. My younger sister Tzipora and my parents were deported in 1942 and 1943 and subsequently murdered in the Nazi camps. My mother on her birthday. After months of hiding, I was arrested and deported to Nazi German concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. I survived 5 concentration camps, Westerbork, Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Merk, and was ultimately liberated by the US Army on the 6th of May, 1945, from Ebensee in Austria. Because I could speak German and English, and I knew a few European languages, was scrappy and clever, I convinced the US Army to recruit me to work in their post-war counterintelligence as a translator in Europe and in 1946 was helped to emigrate to the United States, sponsored by a US Army officer. After having a nervous breakdown and needing to reconcile my past life as a prisoner, I was asked to leave the Army with honor, and I eventually moved to San Francisco, California in 1954 and began to fulfill a lifelong dream of becoming an architect. Already a successful architect in the 1970s, Garcia partnered with Leonid Darwin to create the Holocaust Library and Research Center. Darwin was born in Hamburg, Germany, and fled the Nazis in the late 1930s, coming to the San Francisco Bay Area. Not all of her family escaped. Her mother died in Auschwitz. Darwin, who was actively involved in the Holocaust Library and Research Center for the rest of her life, defined the essence of her work at the institution as follows. I'm quoting. I made it my business to collect books on the Holocaust, no matter what language, period, paragraph. That's it. Opened in 1979, the Holocaust Library and Research Center began with a few paid staff and several volunteers, most of them survivors from Eastern Europe. In addition to collecting Holocaust-related books, photographs, documents, and artifacts, from the very beginning, they were looking for survivors and soldiers who had liberated the camps and were willing to provide testimonies for the Holocaust Library's oral history project. The Holocaust Library and Research Center, among many other institutions in the US, Europe, and Israel, quickly contacted the Jewish Documentation Center in Vienna, headed by Simon Wiesenthal. In a letter written in April 1982, Lonnie Darwin, then Director of Acquisitions at the Holocaust Library and Research Center, reported that one of the Holocaust Library's projects was a systematic mapping of the European camp system, for which she had asked Wiesenthal for help. At the same time, Darwin informed Wiesenthal that, as he requested, she had sent a list of persons with a suspected Nazi past who had settled in the United States after the war to the San Francisco Jewish Bulletin, asking anyone with information about any of them to come forward. The list of alleged war criminals living in the US was compiled by the United States Department of Justice Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the public's help in locating individuals with suspected Nazi or collaborator backgrounds was requested. Wiesenthal sought to actively support this goal through his own network of predominantly Holocaust survivors and found a partner in the newly founded Holocaust Library in San Francisco. On an individual level, as a private action or in connection with their profession, Jews living in San Francisco and the Bay Area have been engaged for years in the search for former Nazis and collaborators in their environment. For example, in August 1975, Leonard Sagan, physician from Palo Alto, California, a member of the medical committee for the Campaign Against Torture, wrote to Simon Wiesenthal asking him for information about whether Hubertus Struckhol, the German scientist then working for NASA, had participated in pseudo-medical experiments in Dachau. These individual initiatives of various personal or professional motivations were channeled at the community level as well by the institutionalized Holocaust Remembrance Organization of the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish community, the Holocaust Library and Research Center. The three initiatives that arose from the 1977 bookstore incident are still in operation today, and are integral elements of the life of the local Jewish community, moving the community as a whole in different ways. In San Francisco, the physical, visible presence of the American Nazi Party in the urban space was the trigger that first triggered an alarm reaction from all groups in the local community, and then united them in a collective action. In the longer term, the Holocaust remembrance, which had hitherto been a typically family-oriented experience, was institutionalized and added a community dimension. In this way, Holocaust remembrance has become an important Jewish communal experience for San Francisco Jews, While all three initiatives, in different ways, have a message that is visible to and meaningful and interpretable by the local non-Jewish community as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. A very interesting one, especially I didn't know about these dynamics that the opening of a right-wing bookshop started. So I found it very, very interesting. I have, as far as I can see, at the moment, no questions or reactions are in the chat so far. So I don't know, should we continue with the presentations and then have the discussion all together of all the three topics? Is that something that the others would agree upon? Or Kinga, what is your, shall we continue with the three presentations?
Yeah, for me, it's
okay. So the next presenter in this panel is Gaëlle Fischer. Hello, I can see a photograph. Oh, hello, nice to see you. Gaëlle Fischer is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Holocaust Studies at the moment at the Leibniz Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. And currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Yad Vashem's International Research Institute for Holocaust Research. She holds various degrees, so a BA, MA, and finally a PhD in history from University College London. And her PhD was also published as a book in 2020, I think, by Bearcan Books. With the title Resettlers and Survivors, Bukovina and the Politics of Belonging in Western Germany and Israel, 1945 to 1989. Her current research, although is more about Romania and the Jewish responses dealing with persecution during the Holocaust. But today, she will talk about the initiatives after post-45 initiatives of surviving Romanian Jews and their struggle for compensation from West Germany during the second, for compensation for persecution during the Second World War and during the Cold War, of course. Yeah? So, Gaëlle, may I ask for a presentation, please?
Yes, I'll share my screen. Okay.
Yes, we can see it perfectly.
That's great. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction and also to the organizers of this conference for the invitation. This paper relates closely to the research I did for my PhD, as we just heard, the book I wrote on organizations of Jewish survivors from Romania, more specifically from Bukovina, living in Israel after World War II. But today I have chosen to focus quite specifically on the activities of the United Restitution Organization. And the reason for this is that this organization was probably the most important actor in the struggle for compensation of Romanian Jewish survivors living outside of Romania during the Cold War. So I want to begin by explaining what drew my attention to this topic. I first became interested in the United Restitution Organization, or the URO, as I will be calling it in this presentation, after I came across the URO manuscripts in the archive of the Institute for Contemporary History, the IFZ in Munich. These are 9 more or less thick manuscripts with yellowing pages dating from the late 50s and early 60s. And containing transcriptions of hundreds of documents about World War II and the Holocaust. The documents are from a range of different, but mostly German archives, and all of the material is in German. As you can see here, volumes 7, 8, and 9 are about different countries, but the first 5 volumes, which are described just as document collections, are actually about Romania, and they are by far the most substantial. Together, volumes 1 to 4 contain more than 300 documents and 600 pages. As for volume 5, it is also about Romania and connects some of the documents of previous volumes with explanations. And as you can see, all but volumes 7 and 9 were put together by one person, someone called Bruno Fischer. The discovery was intriguing for 2 reasons. Firstly, it seemed somewhat surprising to me that so much material was about the Holocaust in Romania, a case that is often deemed forgotten or little known, and which, with respect to the Cold War in particular, is often described as a historiographical blind spot. Secondly, the collection was intriguing because if you look at the contents pages and if you look into the documents, you realize it offers a very peculiar narrative about the Holocaust in Romania, quite different from the narrative other collections offer and quite different from the current state of research. Indeed, the collection presupposes German rather than Romanian responsibility for what happened in the country. This collection starts in the late 1930s with documents about the economic and political penetration of Romania by Nazi Germany, and ends with documents about the dismay of the Nazi authorities at Romania's toleration of Jewish emigration from the country in the summer of 1944. So overall, the collection might be described as offering an exoneration of the Romanian state and leadership by making them look weak and subservient to Nazi German aims. Understanding this collection requires knowing what the United Restitution Organization was and knowing about the Romanian Jewish survivors' struggle for compensation from West Germany during the Cold War. So in what follows, I want to say something about both of these topics. But beyond this, and taking these documents as a starting point, I want to reconsider how the URO worked and what its impact might have been. Indeed, the German historian Hans-Günther Hockertz famously described the URO as the lawyers of the persecuted, but this collection and further documents I found primarily in the archive of the EFZ in Munich suggest that they were much more than this. So I want to make 4 main claims based on the case of Romania about the URO's role and how they worked. Firstly, I believe they influenced the compensation authorities and lawmakers, and with this legislation. Secondly, I believe they influenced historians, and with this, the production of historical knowledge. Thirdly, I believe they influenced the practice and the perception of compensation. And finally, they might have influenced Holocaust memory and historiography. So to begin, a few words about what the URO was. The URO was an Anglo-American legal aid society which was set up in 1948 to help primarily Jewish but also Roma survivors of Nazi persecution around the world make claims for compensation and obtain restitution payments from West Germany. Its focus was on people living outside of Germany and, due to the Cold War, also people living in the West. Its headquarters were in London, and its first chairman from 1948 to 1971 was Norman Bentwich, a British barrister whose book you can see here. Originally set up for 5 years, it expanded massively in the first decade of its existence. At its peak, the URO had 1,000 staff, including 200 lawyers, mostly emigre Jewish lawyers and survivors. It operated in 19 countries and had many more offices, including a central office in Frankfurt. Over the years, it helped an estimated 250,000 survivors file around 500,000 claims. The URO was therefore set up to deal with all kinds of issues, and Romania was just one of the many contexts they dealt with. But as the manuscripts I showed at the start suggest, Romania rapidly became a significant concern for this organization. And this was due to the unusually high number of rejected claims for people from this country and the many legal disputes between Romanian survivors and West German authorities that ensued. The main bone of contention was the question of German responsibility, something known as Deutsche Veranlassung. Indeed, World War II Romania, which you see here on the map, was a Nazi German ally from 1941 to 1944 and was never occupied by the Germans. During the Holocaust, the Romanian state, under the leadership of Ion Antonescu, notoriously carried out its own policies of Jewish persecution and genocide. Due to the convergence of German and Romanian genocidal aims, many of the massacres that took place in Romania involved Romanian participation. Here on the map, you can see forced labor camps in Romania's so-called Old Kingdom, as well as the camps and ghettos in Bukovina, Bessarabia, and Transnistria, to which Jewish citizens, mostly from the borderlands, were deported. And all of these were run by Romanians. For obvious reasons, West German compensation legislation did not foresee compensating people who had not been persecuted by Germans. In other words, it was central to compensation law that Germany or individual Germans had been responsible for damages caused for reparations to be granted. In the case of Romania, as in the case of other countries where there had not been formal German occupation and collaborationist governments or regimes had persecuted Jews on their own terms, German liability was therefore repeatedly called into question by the US German compensation authorities. What made the case of Romania especially important for the URO was the sheer number of potential applicants. An estimated 280,000 to 350,000 people were killed in territory under Romanian control during the war. But a further 300,000 were able to survive in the country, and of these, many emigrated to the West after 1945, especially to Israel. In the 1950s, the number of potential Romanian Jewish claimants was estimated at around 40,000. And since in the context of the Cold War, it did not appear that communist Romania would compensate these people, for survivors, convincing the West German authorities that Germany was responsible for what had happened was the only option. And this is the process in which the URO came to play an instrumental role. So what did the URO do? As mentioned, based on my research, I want to suggest that their impact was fourfold. Firstly, they influenced the authorities and lawmakers and eventually legislation by shaping the interpretation of the past and of the law. Indeed, West German compensation law was very much in the making in the 1950s and 60s. There was no unified practice, and different courts would reach different decisions. In general, the authorities were relatively overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge they needed, especially as to how to determine and interpret German responsibility in different countries. The URO seized the chance to influence this situation. This was the primary aim of their publications, such as those I mentioned at the beginning, or such as the one you can see here. The forewords to the collections I showed at the start mentioned that they were primarily meant for ministries, authorities, and the courts. They were designed to answer the courts and compensation authorities' specific legal questions and discourage them from even looking for information elsewhere. Over time, the URO grew increasingly strategic, organizing the material thematically, using lists, and defining legal terminology. While these publications looked like independent legal advice and historical material, they were instruments to encourage the courts and authorities to rule in favor of claimants. It is difficult to measure exactly the extent of the URO's influence, but especially in later years, lawyers and prosecutors would often refer to the URO's documents in their justifications and verdicts. And though compensation law, which dated from 1956, was only revised once in 1965, it appears that the work of the URO and its members led to a more rigorous definition, for example, of the word Veranlassung. So in 1965, based on the work done some years before by Max Münz, the date of 6th of April, 1941 was adopted to the text of the law as the start of German responsibility for persecution in Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. This revision resulted in more consistent, but also many more positive rulings for claimants. One of my main discoveries from looking at the material on Romania at the EFZ pertains to the influence of members of the URO on German historians and thereby on the production of historical knowledge. Indeed, German historians became key actors in the debates about compensation because the courts relied on their so-called expert reports or Gutachten to make their decisions. This was, for instance, the case of Martin Brochat, the EFZ's later director. When he joined the EFZ in 1955 as a young man, he was put in charge of writing many expert reports, and Romania was one of his areas of expertise. In his first report on the subject, he dismissed German responsibility completely. However, in the 100-page report on Romania he wrote in 1957, which you can see here, he adopted a much broader understanding of German responsibility. And with this, he contradicted both his earlier statements and other expert reports that were written almost at the same time. He also departed from the views of leading historians on the subject, such as Andreas Hilgruber. The importance of this 1957 report and of Brochat's change of perspective cannot be understated. The report served the compensation courts and authorities for decades and led to many more positive outcomes for survivors. It seems noteworthy that its drafting coincided with Brochat's first contact with the URO. In his first letters to Brochat in 1955, the then director of the URO's Frankfurt office, Kurt May, had emphasized Romania's economic dependency on Nazi Germany, arguing this was something legal scholars had often overlooked. And he also drew Brochat's attention to the legal definition of different terms, including Veranlassung, which he said fell short of responsibility, and offered him documentation. The cooperation between the URO and the EFZ on this topic grew further still after this report was published. It led the author of the manuscripts I showed at the start, Bruno Fischer, a Romanian Israeli lawyer born in Czernowitz, to get in touch with Brochat. This marked the beginning of a decade-long cooperation between the URO and the EFZ. Brochat and Fischer would share documents and exchange opinions on the outcomes of different cases. They didn't always agree, but as the postcards Fischer sent Brochat over the years indicate, the relationship was friendly. And when Brochat moved on to other things in the mid-1960s, the collaboration continued with other colleagues. Historian Ino Arndt, for example, was who ended up writing most of the expert reports on Romania later on, relied heavily on Fischer's advice. My third point is that the URO contributed to the shift in the practice and perception of compensation in West Germany. This is a shift many scholars have noted, and it constituted a shift from the framing of compensation as a negative and adversarial process to the view that this was more of a social or welfare policy with a symbolic purpose, and that what mattered were the victims and their rehabilitation. Looking at their work on Romania, I believe the URO contributed to this shift in several ways. Firstly, they created and drew attention to new sources and resources, particularly Jewish ones. Until then, lawmakers and experts had mostly relied on statements from former perpetrators and German sources. In his expert reports, Bruno Fischer repeatedly pointed out that non-Jews did not have the overview and that documentary evidence might not always exist. According to him, the victims were best placed to know what had happened. He therefore often quoted Jewish witnesses at length. Secondly, if a claimant's statement was not clear, he encouraged the courts and historians to give the victims the benefit of the doubt. Knowledge was limited, and if mistakes were to be made, they should better be made in the interest of the claimants than the other way around. Finally, while he answered the authorities' specific questions, he constantly reminded them of the wider context of the Nazi so-called final solution. So in 1968, for example, having been asked about the living conditions in one specific Transnistrian camp, he first answered the question as best he could, but then concluded that, I quote, "The whole of Transnistria was therefore a single, strictly guarded Jewish reservation in which Jews were temporarily held until the end of operations, namely until the time had come for them to be handed over to the Nazis for extermination." The compensation authorities' questions about specific circumstances were not ignored, but in a sense they were subordinated to the more general explanations and descriptions of the events and the horror, which left no doubt as to how they should rule. Finally, my fourth claim is about the URO's impact on Holocaust memory and historiography. Here, my views are more ambivalent and also more tentative. I think it is important to remember that the UROs saw their task as purely juridical, not historical, and that any impact on memory or historiography was unintended. But this does not mean they didn't have an impact. On the one hand, they might be said to have helped put victims in the center of research on the Holocaust. But on the other hand, they might also be said to have disseminated and given credence to an exculpatory and misleading narrative of the Holocaust in Romania. This certainly had an effect on the narratives of Romanian survivors. Here you can see a typical article from the period describing Bukovinian Jews as victims of the Nazis or Nazi persecutees rather than victims of Romanians. Here again, the extent of the URO's influence is impossible to measure, but it is certain that Romanian survivors' willingness to speak honestly about their experiences, or the way they spoke about their experiences, was influenced by the version of the past the URO successfully promoted. This might even have contributed in the long run to the delay to research on the Holocaust in Romania. In the end, of course, this has less to do with the URO than with the particularities of the compensation system that made them adopt such a stance. But I think it is still part of the legacy of this organization. So to conclude, the URO was not a survivor organization in the conventional sense, but it represented survivors and thereby shaped their collective identifications. Looking at the case of Romanian survivors, I would argue that the URO was not merely the lawyers of the persecuted, but a key actor in the politics of compensation and memory during the Cold War. With this in mind, I think this case can be interpreted in two ways. On the one hand, it shows the importance of compensation as an arena for interactions between members of the societies of the persecuted and the perpetrators. On the other hand, this case highlights the limits of the legalistic and instrumental approach to the past encouraged by the compensation system and its unintended consequences for memory and justice. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gaëlle, for a very interesting presentation. I have, at the moment, no question to you, but since we are time-wise, we are not doing so badly, may I maybe have a little question for you? Yes. First of all, what would interest me is, because the URO seems to have been a really rather big and effective organization involving lots of experts. How did they finance this? How did they manage to finance this big enterprise? Really, that is, I think, something that has always struck me as very interesting. Do you know a little bit about this? How they managed to create this amount of expertise? So very.
I don't know if we want to have questions now or at the end.
Or we can do both, but yes, if you prefer that we do questions all together at the end, then I skip this and let's go to the third presenter if he agrees. Our third, sorry, I made a mistake here. So Petre, our good old friend Petre Matei, he is a researcher with the Elie Wiesel National Institute for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania. He holds a PhD from the University of Bucharest and has been a research fellow in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, as far as I know, and has carried out lots of oral history interviews with Roma and with Jewish survivors, has published a whole lot of articles, some of which I've read personally, and also a book that came out last year here about the Roma, which is called the Roma condition and their Diskurswandel, so the changing discourse about Roma. And I think the question of Roma and their recognition as victims of racial persecution is a very special one. And I think the comparison here with the Jewish cases can be very fruitful. So he is talking today about exactly this topic, about Jewish and Roma survivors associations in communist Romania and their efforts for German compensation. Please, Petre.
Thank you very much for the nice words and for having me here. For the beginning, I have to say that when I applied in December for this workshop, I just wanted to make a sort of comparison, yeah. But then I realized that during this 2 days, yeah, of workshop, that the other presentations are very focused. Mine won't be that, because I have to deal with a longer period of time. So I'm talking here mainly about those attempts to get compensation for Jewish survivors. So let's say more broadly, late 60s, early 70s, and also to talk about the Roma survivors in the 1980s. Another thing I would like to say from the very beginning, it's quite difficult to talk about associations, for example, in the case of the Roma. So until the collapse of communism, Roma were not recognized as an ethnic minority. They couldn't organize themselves, they couldn't have NGOs and so on, let alone an association of the Roma survivors. And still, both Jews and Roma applied to get compensation. And I would say that during my presentation, so there is another actor, yeah, which is quite important in this equation, and this is the Romanian state, the communist state trying to get access to resources. In this case, to the money they hoped the Romanian authorities to get through the Jewish and Roma survivors, yeah, from Germany. My presentation is not very colorful. It's full of text. I'm just stressed that I have to say as much as possible, just to offer this outline. Yeah. So very shortly about Romania and the Holocaust, and Gaëlle said that quite well. Romania was a sovereign state. Yeah? It adopted its own anti-Semitic measures and organized deportations of Jews and Roma to Transnistria. Then it was administered by the Romanians, and the responsibility belonged to the Romanians. So Jews and Roma were victims, and we could compare of the Romanians and the Germans in 1944. So of the Hungarians, there were Jews deported from northern Transylvania, then part of Hungary, to Auschwitz, and so on. So we could talk about a shared responsibility. About the German one, it was talked a lot. About the Romanian one, quite little. And what is here interesting is this attempt, this effort of the Romanian state, which was quite tenuous, to get, as I said, money from the West Germans for the victims, not only of the Germans, but also for the victims of the measures conducted by the Romanian authorities during the war. So, yeah. Very shortly about communist Romania, hard currency, and the Holocaust. So this effort of the Romanian state to get hard currency is only a part of the story. Yeah? It was a plan, but Romanians were conducted, I'm talking here about the Romanian Secret Service, Securitate, several other operations, and for example, the West German government, the Israeli government were paying money, big money to the Romanians to allow the immigration of ethnic Germans and Jews to West Germany or to Israel. And then after 1967, Romania was among the first communist states resuming diplomatic relations with West Germany. The Romanian authorities identified some other perspectives, yeah, some other possibilities, opportunities, yeah. For example, and I'm talking here about operations conducted by the Secret Service. There was one called Recunoștință, the gratitude, pensions for the ethnic Germans who had served in the Wehrmacht. Yeah? Monument, obtaining money for the identification and maintenance of the graves of German soldiers killed in Romania. Yeah, and then, and this is what we are going to talk about, the operation Recolta, harvest, obtaining compensation for the victims of Nazi Germany. So the Romanian Secret Service was quite important in this story. Very shortly about this operation, yeah, Recolta, harvest. We are talking here mainly about two different periods. According to the way the Romanian authorities intervened in this, yeah. So you have a not official one between February 1967 and March 1970. It's an official peer stage with the authorities, Romanian authorities, acting undercover through intermediaries. So we are talking about the so-called private channel, Jewish survivors petitioners who were represented by some lawyers, usually German lawyers, who were considered to be reliable by the Romanian Secret Service, and the other channel was quasi-official, if you want. It was not official. The so-called through the Federația Comunităților Rele, so the Federation of the Jewish Communities in Romania. Its president was Chief Rabbi Moses Rosen. And then, leaving that aside, we have the official stage when the state intervened and tried to negotiate with the Federal Republic of Germany. Yeah? We're going to talk here about the not official between 1967 and 97. Yeah? Again, this can be divided into two other different segments. February 1967, October 1968. It's the period when they realize that, look, there is an opportunity, but we still don't have an authority in charge. You know, there are just some ideas flowing around, and nothing really happens. So we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs non-acting actually in this period. And then you have between October 68 and May 69, the involvement of the Secret Service, which got a new impetus in May 1969 until March 1970. Why? Because the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party, so the supreme authority, decided, okay, we'll endorse what Securitate does because it's good, and there is a hope to get some money. Yeah? So about the first period, as I said, it's only the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs which is sort of acting, doing something. So, and it's very interesting because we are talking about different perspectives. We have the West German government, which says, okay, we are going to resume the relations with Romania, eventually some other countries in Eastern Europe. Are we going to be attacked, invaded with lots of claims and so on? And they said, no, we are quite well protected legally. We have Bundesentschädigungsgesetz and so on. We have different articles. We have the London Debt Agreement and so on. We have Romania, who renounced in 1947 any claims and so on. This was a perspective. And this is what the Germans will stick to. Then we have in February 1967 a perspective of Moses Rosen, yeah, who, after talking to some leaders from the World Jewish Congress, came with a memo and said that, I quote, that the time has come for the Romanian citizens of Jewish nationality, victims of Hitler persecution. The idea is to finally claim this compensation because we are finally having this diplomatic relations. Yeah? And he also said that the World Jewish Congress was willing to offer its support. The third step is this reaction of the Romanian authorities, which were not quite interested at the time. So, for example, after a few months, we have finally an answer from the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs saying that, yeah, maybe we should talk to the Federation, and they should recommend the Jewish victims to apply for to claim compensation if they haven't done that yet. What is interesting, they are not aware of all these complicated issues like the Territorialitätsprinzip in the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz. Yeah? They believe that the only problem is this with the Peace Treaty 1947, which disappointed Moses Rosen, who wanted for himself and his federation a more active role. He also suggested that a legal commission should be set up at the federation to discuss each Jewish claim, and also some from the Romanian government should be part of that. So what he wanted was a strong involvement of the Romanian state to push things a little bit. Yeah? But nothing happened. So until 1968, all this remained simply a plain. The Romanian authorities ignored the issue, I would say. So you have no working group, nothing. You can't find that in the archives. Yeah, and then in October 1968, you have finally the other stage when the authority in charge, the more influential, is the secret police, the secret service, who in a report signed by the commander of the Securitate, they are outlining several ways of getting money, and among others, you also see that with Recolta, with Harvest, saying that we should apply, we should make things happen, we should get access to this money. But again, they were quite superficial. They had no idea whatsoever how actually the compensatory legislation in Germany worked. They had some ideas, a pilot project with a Jew from Romania combined with another one from Hungary who had applied on time during Bundesrückerstattungsgesetz, and they hoped to get like $2 million. So the idea was quite simple. If we get $2 million from one Jew, more or less, we could get a lot from many other Jews we have. So Jews, we are talking only about Jews at the moment, were seen by the state as a resource. Yeah, through them one could get to the money. Yeah? Now, what was the plan of the Secret Service? They envisioned that in steps. The first one was to compile, to identify the Jewish survivors, claimants, yeah, to compile those lists. And what is here important is they didn't think, they didn't consider involving, yeah, officially Moses Rosen. They just thought of doing that through different informants, yeah. And once they had this list, to talk to some German lawyers to convince them to come to Romania to negotiate all that. Actually, we have that they asked like 15% from the total amount they hope to get thanks to this operation. And then to the idea was to have the federation, yeah, again, it's seen as a passive actor, sign these powers of attorney, yeah, that these lawyers were empowered to represent them in front of the West German authorities. And yeah, we have these lawyers coming to Bucharest in March 1969, being invited by the Romanian Bank for Foreign Trade. It was a cover for the Secret Service. Lots of Jewish survivors or claimants going to them, and this was quite frustrating for Romania, for Moses Rosen, because he was asked by the Jewish survivors, victims, and so on throughout the country, and they were mainly asking information. And Moses Rosen had no information whatsoever. Yeah? So he was quite upset, I would say. And only on the last day of their stay in Bucharest, these German lawyers also wanted to talk to him. Roses was quite upset. And what he said is, the main idea is, no, we shouldn't do that. Just try to get some more information from them. And I just don't want that the Jews apply to these lawyers who are, he said, crooks, because what is happening in Romania is wrong. So, and I quote, the Germans pay compensation, however, not to the Jews living in Romania, but those who have taken refuge in Israel. Those in Germany benefit from another legislation and receive more. And he also added that he preferred to trust the World Jewish Congress expertise over the claims of some German lawyers. Yeah. Then we have another. We're still in this period. Moses Rosen still had some valuable information from Stefan Roth, who was the executive director of the World Jewish Congress European Division. So in January 1969, he sent this memo containing an outline, what chances the Romanian Jews living in Romania stood to get some compensation. And he said that according to the German compensatory legislation, no chance. So there were some chances, but the Romanians, unlike the Hungarian Jews, didn't apply on time. And Bundesentschädigungsgesetz is quite, I mean, relies heavily on the territoriality. No chance. So what he suggested, Stefan Roth, was not a legal solution, but a political one. Yeah, the only chance would have been for the Romanian government to enter negotiations with the West German government. Yeah, because otherwise there would have been no chance. And he just said, look, there are some precedents, like all these Western countries getting compensation for their citizens. Yeah? What happened? It was that impetus because the Secret Service got this that agreement from the Communist Party, from the Central Committee, and this is the moment when finally the channel Rosen, the Federation, was activated. He was contacted by the Romanian authorities, Secret Service, and so on, in an attempt to use his clout in order to benefit from the World Jewish Congress expertise and lobby. And the one we're talking here about is Naum Goldman, who answered to Rosen that we are sure we want to help. But look, according to the same German law, the individual claims method has the smallest chance of success. Is exactly what the Romanians were doing through that so-called private channel, Jews represented by German lawyers. A better method would be that of an interstate convention, what Stefan Roth had said a few months earlier. And finally, a third solution, that a group would deal with the problem. And in this case, the Federation of Jewish Communities might cheat on behalf of the claimant. So they were talking about the Article 239, which allowed West Germany to negotiate, discuss with groups of victims in situations when this territoriality principle was not fulfilled as a condition. Yeah. So Rosen's plan was to act. He wanted to be recognized as a leader of a group with whom the German government negotiated. He initiated several approaches, official and not official. I'm afraid I won't have that much time. I don't know how I am with the time, and I will. So basically, what he did was to try to get audiences, sent letters to the federal chancellor. He talked less official to the World Jewish Congress and the experts, and quite important, he invited Ernst Katzenstein to Romania in November '69, and Katzenstein basically helped him or provided feedback, said to him, look, you won't get compensation for confiscated properties. Yeah? It's another law and so on. So he tried to help, but in the end, what happened was that Moses Rosen had this idea of getting as much compensation for the Jewish survivors. They sent that at the end of November to the chancellor. The chancellor sent it, of course, to the Bundesfinanzministerium, and the answer was refusal. So in no case did the legislators intend to take into account in article and so on those groups of victims who were nationals of Eastern European states still living there and so on. And again, we're coming to that issue. The only possibility, but possibility, not obligation for Germany, would be to have this interstate bilateral agreement. Yeah. So we have in February 1970, Rosen forced to say to some high-ranking officers from the Secret Service that, look, there is no possibility, neither through federation nor through other individuals, be that Goldman and so on. He is blocked as well. So the only solution would have been that to have that kind of official agreement, yeah, Romania and Germany, West Germany. So based on all this, some high senior officials, Romanians, recommended to the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party to start that. And in the end, the Romanians did that. They managed to get an interesting collection of documents concerning that. But again, not respecting actually the compensatory legislation. So they also asked for confiscated properties and so on. What happened? So they were quite optimistic. Yeah, I won't get into detail. So what I want to say is the Germans refused. The only exception they wanted to pay compensation for would have been for the victims of the pseudo-medical experiences, experiments. But the problem is the Romanians had managed to gather information just for 14 such victims, which were quite poorly documented, and the Germans would have paid maybe 500,000 marks, quite a little compared to the hundreds of millions of Deutsche Mark the Romanians had expected. So the Romanians refused and requesting joint compensation for all claims. A summary for the Jewish survivors. Jews were recognized as an ethnic group. They had organizations, federal communications of Jews, chief rabbi. They had their own archives, databases of survivors, experience in working with Romanian Jew survivors, claiming compensations and so on abroad. As I said, well-connected, lobby possibilities. What is here interesting is it was not in this case only an issue of pressure coming from above, from the Secret Service, but also from the below, from normal Jews who had also been deported, who hadn't managed to leave the country, and whose relative, for example, in the meantime were already in Israel and got compensation in the West. And you have this frustration. I mean, he got that, he suffered just the same like I did. Why don't I get? So a certain pressure exerted on Moses Rosen to act. Well, this was the first part. I will try to concentrate that with the Roma. So Roma were not recognized. No opportunities to organize collectively, let alone Roma Survival Association. Couldn't influence the policies affecting them. Defined as a social category. So we had Roma who were not, well, quite considered to be an ethnic group, but we had already Roma activists who believed the opposite. And these activists tried to find a basis for dialogue with the Romanian state in the hope to get also some ethnic aims accomplished. And to achieve that, they used internal opportunities, a new Roma integration program drafted in 1977. We won't talk about that. And external ones, and this is my hypothesis, I will talk about that. Connections to the international Roma movement and discussions about Holocaust compensation for Roma, especially after 1981. So what happened, and what is quite important here, is that International Roma Union in the 1970s, with its focus on Holocaust compensation, Romanians or Romanian Roma getting finally connected to that international Roma movement. And of course, this prior interest of the Securitate in the Holocaust compensation. So mingling all this, we get to what happened in the 1980s with the Roma. So, and this international Roma movement got quite important, and with its interest in the compensation, especially after 1981 or during actually that third Congress of the International Roma Union in May in Göttingen. And also Wiesenthal was invited, if I'm not wrong, and that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship with Romani Rosa. Already in 1980, the organizers sent lots of invitations. And in Romania, for example, there were like 5-6 invitations, but only one person got from the Securitate the chance to leave the country and participate in this Congress, and this was Ion Cioabă, not some others like Nicolae Gheorghe, who was a sociologist of Roma origins and so on. So Securitate preferred Cioabă. What we have in May 1981 in Göttingen, a new leadership. The vice president was Romani Rose, and then in the 80s he was also in charge of this compensation issue within the International Roma Union, and the elected one in the presidium was, among others, there were 18 on the whole, Ion Schwab. Yeah? And Ion Schwab got quite an asset for the secret police. Yeah? But what is, you know, they could control some information. What is here important is this question of the Holocaust compensation debated at the Congress. So they talked already about 500,000 Roma being exterminated by Nazis and so on. They talked about applying for compensation. Huh? What is here interesting is Chaba didn't really seem interested in that story with compensation already. Yeah? Those who were more interested and made him ask, or try to, and manage to, were actually the Securitate officers reading his report he had to write when coming back from abroad. And this is a quote. It was decided that in June, the Congress Presidium would meet in Budapest to take a decision. Schwab, Ioan, is part of that Presidium. As an idea, we discussed the opportunity of making, that means the officers, of making some claims on behalf of the Romanian side. Schwab declared that if we find such cases, he would raise the questions without any hesitation. And what happens here is Schwab is treated quite well. Yeah, he is allowed to leave the country. He goes to Italy and Yugoslavia. The president and the general secretary of the International Roma Union were Yugoslavian Roma. They talked about compensation. In Belgrade, in Rome, he contacted Bruno Nicolini and Mirela Carpati. Again, talked about compensation. He was asked by those two in Rome to write a letter to be sent to the Pope. And he sent that with his testimony, which is quite interesting because he focused on the so-called responsibility of the Germans for what happened, for the suffering inflicted to the Roma, although this is not historically correct. I mean, the Romanians were guilty, were responsible for what happened to the Roma. They were sent by Romanian authorities to Transnistria under Romanian administration and so on. But quite interesting, he wrote, for example, these are just some fragments. The German soldiers took our carts and so on. German soldiers, if they were seen by Germans, were mercilessly shot and so on. You know, 35,000 gypsies who were killed in Transnistria. These differences can be understood taking into account what Schwab hoped to achieve, to get. And of course, compensation from West Germany, he couldn't have afforded to raise this issue in front of the Romanian authorities. Yeah? Now, questions by the Securitate Schwab implied that the Romanian Roma had quite good chances of receiving compensation. Again, what Securitate says, there was supposed to be another meeting, and they say in order to receive full clarification about the amount of money, we should let him go. Yeah? Then in 1985, you have another letter sent to the court in the Hague. Yeah? Again, the Germans were the only one killed. Yeah? November 85, he sent, he drafted, no, this is something else. So this is also interesting because it is a way, I mean, these discussions within the International Roma Union, it was definitely a way of empowering the Roma, also in their relation with the Romanian state, which didn't recognize the Roma as an ethnic group. Yeah? And for example, in November 85, Chancellor Kohl received a delegation led by Romani Rose, and there were some discussions that this compensation issue would be approached in the Bundestag. Yeah? And what is quite interesting, you have Romani Rose, Raico Đurić going a few days thereafter and talking to Nicolae Gheorghe and to Ion Schwab. And what is here important is, look, there is money, big amount of money, we could get that, we should do that, but to achieve that, we should get organized. And in each country, Roma should, or there should be a Roma organization to gather this information, this documentation, and so on. And there should be a Roma organization to act as a sort of partner for the Germans, yeah. And then the German compensation was to be transferred to the states where the former Roma deportees live. So I simplify a lot because I don't know if I have time. So Roma organization in each country should prepare such studies and statistics. Yeah, the Federal Republic of Germany and the government would have paid them this compensation. And Schwaber's report on the meeting with Zurich gave the impression that the states with former Roma deportees stood chances, yeah, to get significant amounts of money as global compensation, provided that Roma organizations existed. And these organizations didn't exist in Romania. Again, November '88, yeah, Said Palic, the president of this International Roma Union, said to Schwaber, look, I want to come to Hungary, I want to come to Romania, I want to see what happened lately with this documentation and so on. Yeah, Schwaber wrote to the Securitate, Mr. Bali criticized me for not being any more interested in the money that the German state has to give us as compensation and so on. And you have Balic coming in March 1989 to Romania. And what is quite interesting is Schwaber sent a memo to Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania, and saying, they refer to earlier actions to obtain compensation in the 1970s when at the initiative of the Romanian authorities and so on. And he also...
Petre,
yeah.
I think you have extended the time allotted to you, so I must ask you to wrap up pretty quickly.
Okay.
Because there is lots of questions that people want to ask, and I think if we want to have time for that.
Compensation, yeah, you're right. Compensation versus organization. So in a subtle way, I don't know if it was envisioned as such. The Roma were not recognized as an ethnic group. Some activists thought of using this, you know, as a sort of leverage to get a form of organization, of recognition from the Romanian state, implying that we, the Roma, are useful because through us, through such an organization, the Romanian state could benefit from like 7 million and so on. You know? The Securitate didn't react well, and he was said, look, don't, but this was just a few months before the collapse of communism, and that was it. So, yeah, this was a sort of conclusion, but yeah.
I think we can clarify a lot in the discussion, but I think it's really time that we gave the other participants a chance. So I think the first question here that was raised was by Daniel Schuch, and he has a question to Kinga Frojimovics, and he would like her to elaborate a little bit or draw a comparison from the case she has presented to the Jewish protests in Skokie, so northern Chicago, in the 1970s, so in 77 actually, 78, when which basically in the end led to the foundation of the Illinois Holocaust Memorial Center, or Holocaust Museum and Education Center, as it's called, yeah? And there is a parallel case there, and the question is, do you also see the parallels, Kinga?
So, thank you for the question. Yes, it was paralleled from the point of view that it started in 77, exactly the same year, exactly the same month. It started in April in Skokie, and it started in April in San Francisco as well. And it was also similar because it started with the action from the local Nazis. In San Francisco, they opened this bookstore, and in Skokie, they planned an open big march throughout the main square of the city. but then started all the differences that in San Francisco it's mainly remained the incidents mainly remained in the Jewish communities area. So they established a committee, and they started their different initiatives. Which was after that they established, they was also open, of course, for the public, but it was an inner Jewish issue in San Francisco. In Skokie, it was from the beginning also a Jewish issue, but not only in Skokie, but a nationwide Jewish issue. So, for example, the Jewish War Veterans Association of America sent 100,000 mails to their members to participate or to act somehow against the plan. Also, the city and the Skokie and of course is part of the Chicago metropolitan area. All the other religious, the churches and other religious associations are participated in the plans to react to this march. And for example, all the ethnic groups, the different ethnic groups of Skokie are participated. So it was Lithuanians, Romanians, Hungarians, everybody that it was recognized as an ethnic group in Skokie, they participated. So at the end, the Nazis didn't march through the city, and also the counter marches didn't happen because it was no need anymore. So that's it.
Thank you very much for the answer. One short question that would interest me in this context is that in Skokie, actually, the interesting thing was, I think that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was not engaged on the Jewish side, but in favor of the right-wing Nazi protest marches. Was there any involvement of the ACLU in San Francisco as well? Do you know something about that?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, thank you. So we can go on to the next question. This comes from Katharina Stengel, and it's towards Gaëlle Fischer. She says, I have become aware of the URO, especially Kurt May and his activities in various contexts, but there seems to be very little research on the organization itself so far. How can it be explained that the URO eventually remains so unknown? Gaëlle?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good point, and I think the only research really is this essay by Hans-Günter Hochkatz, and I wonder whether I have to speculate a bit about why there's not so much on this, and I think it might be because the organization existed until 2009, and that perhaps archival material has sort of become known only more recently. It's also sort of spread out across the world due to the sort of different offices. And another point, I think, which again, I can only speculate, but based on my interviews with survivors from Romania, I would argue that this is a topic people didn't necessarily speak about very willingly, even if it was a very important topic in the 50s and 60s. I feel like it's not sort of stayed important in the memorial discourse, perhaps, and this is perhaps also linked to sort of the fact that the narratives were strategic, but also sort of avoiding the stereotype of wanting to claim money and the sort of perhaps awkwardness of speaking about that. So I think the topic just hasn't been given the importance that the sources would suggest it deserves. Yeah. Should I answer also your question, Herr Gerhard Baumgartner? You're muted.
I would add another one by Julie Dawson, maybe, who is one of the participants here. She asked about the testimonies, about the written testimonies and how they were organized. And if you could talk a little bit about that and the structure and the format of the written testimonies.
I know that Julie has had to leave because she messaged me, so I will tell her in person. But yeah, the material, yeah.
Do you want to do this on a individual level maybe, or is it interesting for everybody?
I think I can tell her individually.
Okay, perfect. So if you have a short answer to my question, then
yeah, I think that they financed themselves by getting a percentage of the sort of gains from the claims. That's my understanding. And I know that there was an interview with Benjamin Ferencz that's at USHMM, in the archives USHMM, and he mentions a contingent fee. So this is something, there was probably a starting fee basically to make the claim, but as I haven't worked in the archives of the institution itself, I'm not fully aware of the mechanics.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go to the next question. Archival material. So there is a question for Petre. Were there any attempts for Roma in Romania to reach out to other Roma organizations before the IRU was formed? For example, to Roma civil rights movement in Western Europe in the 1960s, which was also heavily focused on indemnities from Western Germany. A question from, if I read the name correctly, Wegewitz, M. Wegewitz. Do you know something about this?
No. So the Roma organizations, I mean, they were in the interwar period and so on, they were quite strong, but in 1949 they were dismantled. So you don't have activists, people identified as such until the late 1970s. Yeah? And no, there were some leaders from the previous Roma movement in the 40s who are again to be found, but in the 70s, yeah, in the late 70s. So the answer is no. You had Roma activists from Romania going abroad, but actually they had left the country already in the 40s. They were not anymore Romanian Roma. You have, for example, Vaida Voievod, who's quite important in France and played an important role in the 60s, talking about compensation, but I couldn't call him anymore. I mean, he didn't play any role anymore in Romania. Yeah, and I would like to apologize. I realized I talked a lot, and I'm really sorry. So for that, I can't.
We are still within our time frame limit, so I think we can look for some more questions. I'm just checking if there is something here. No open questions, and no. I have a little general question to the participants. Petre, you especially were talking or suggesting that basically the Romanian Communist Party state were interested in using compensation claims to generate basically the income of foreign currency but if I'm not mistaken, the case of Romania in this is not, so to speak, a very maybe not an exception, I would call it. Yeah. So I think that very similar things were going on in Yugoslavia, for example, after 1945 in the negotiations, and also to a certain extent, I think in the beginning Israel was not very strong in supporting individual restitution claims. Am I wrong there, or is this just is my information, so to speak, outdated on this?
So we're talking on the whole, not only about Roma, talking about Eastern Europe, the Germans, starting in 1971, they had some exceptions like Hungary and Yugoslavia, and even some for Poland, and there were some compensation forms. I mean, they were paid, but for example, for these victims of the pseudo-medical experiments and so on, and there were some other lump compensation, I mean, amounts of money paid to these countries, but the Germans used that in a flexible way, just to pay to the Romanians. And the Romanians were very convinced that they would get this compensation to a certain extent, because they were, after the Soviet Union, the first communist country resuming diplomatic relations. And for an amount of time, like 2-3 years, that played an important role. But they exaggerated. They were quite convinced they still can use this card and get also this compensation, which was not the case, because if the Germans had paid compensation to the Romanians, you had this domino effect, and they should have paid to everybody, and this would have been a very bad idea. And of course, they said no. So, if I'm not wrong, also in those cases where compensation, where money was paid to Poland and Yugoslavia and so on, this compensation were used, this money, they were not used actually for the victims. They were used for the state, for investments and economy. But I wouldn't compare Israel to countries like Romania, because in this case you had Luxembourg and so on. So,
okay. Thank you very much. So do we have questions from the participants to each other? Is there any things? Gaëlle, would you want to raise a question or in the discussion? Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would have a very short question for Petre, just whether the Romanian sort of the documents you've looked at in Romania, if they ever mention the United Restitution Organization, or if they have any interest in what they're doing.
I didn't come across that, but maybe also because I didn't know where to look and until now. But I definitely came across some mentions of the Institut for Zeitgeschichte, and there were some Moses Rosen for a while, because the Romanians didn't want to give information for several years. So the Germans wanted to double check, I mean, all these claims coming from Israel and so on, to make sure that that person saying that I want to get money for the David Stern, that did wear that David Stern and so on. So definitely needed historical information. And they tried to get it officially from the Romanian authorities, didn't manage to, after a while, and took several years after resuming these diplomatic relations. They accepted the Romanians, but for that period of time, as Kronzeuge, galt Moses Rosen. So he was seen as instrumental, his information. But I will have another look at my documents. And yeah, I also want to talk to you more about that, because it sounds quite interesting, and it's also interesting.
Kinga, do you have a question to your colleagues and participants? Okay, then we have a little bit of time according to my time schedule. Petre, can I ask you a question and ask for a very short answer? As far as but I can't read Romanian, but as far as I can see, I find it interesting that the discourse about Transnistria, the Jewish discourse about Transnistrian deportation and the Roma, they don't, somehow they are not combined. They are quite separate. Why is that? Or am I mistaken there?
Well, both, I mean, if we compare Trouble and Moses Rosen, they say basically the same thing. The Germans were guilty. Yeah? Katzenstein could say, look, cool it off and so on. Yeah? They didn't have much to do. I mean, Trouble in 1980s with Moses Rosen and so on earlier. What we have in the 1980s, there is a sort of cooperation between an intellectual like Nicolae Gheorghe with Radu Ioanid from the what was to become United States Holocaust Museum, yeah? Talking, yeah. But these discourses appeared, I would say, in different contexts. But what created this sort of homogeneity, unity, was a common interest in getting this compensation. To say we were victims of the Romanians wouldn't have bring them any further, wouldn't have brought them any further. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I meant something different. That the victim account, that the victim accounts, the Jewish victim accounts, don't really mention the Roma, and the Roma victim accounts don't really mention the Jews. That I find that very interesting.
Oral history, no. I came across lots of interviews I conducted with the Roma survivors talking about Jewish victims in Transnistria.
Okay, that's news to me then. Okay, so if there are no more, oh, sorry, I see some more questions here. Or am I mistaken? No. Okay, so I think we'll stop here. The next panel is going to start in 20 minutes. So if I'm correctly informed, we will have a break now. I thank you all very much for your presentations. I thank the participants for staying with us and for the questions they've raised. It was very interesting for me. I hope to see you soon all again in one or the other form. No, hopefully not only just in a digital format. Thank you very much. And I hand over back to the conference organizers. Thank you.